Hey listeners, if you like this podcast, check out our other shows, The Study Table and Training Table. Listen to archived content and in-depth interviews with insiders working with student athletes. It's on our website, www.fredopie.com. Welcome to the Dinner Table, a discussion with food as a lens into cultures and societies. I'm your host, Fred Opie.
On today's show, Fred discusses culinary commonalities with Dr. Gustavo Licón at an event at Ithaca College. Enjoy the show.
Thank you for joining us. I'm Dr. Gustavo Licón, and I will play the host and interviewer. So tonight's event is a part of our Beyond Community series, and the subtitle of tonight's event is Culinary Commonalities. And so tonight is my pleasure to have Dr. Frederick Douglass Opie. He's a professor of history and foodways at Babson College. And the book that he will be talking about today is Upsetting the Apple Cart, Black and Latino Coalitions in New York City, from Protest to Public Office. Can you tell us a little bit about your insights on community?
When I think of community, I think everybody, if you stop and reflect on it, you're a member of different communities at the same time. And that's the case that I found when doing this particular research. There are people who have a strong sense of community from where they work, from where they go to school, from the neighborhood they live in, from the housing, from the public housing sector, from where they go to play stickball in the case of New York, where they go and listen to music and where they dance. So community has multiple meanings, and people move in and out of many communities and don't necessarily realize it. They may see themselves as a member of a particular family or a block, but outside your block, you still go to other places where that's your community as well.
Okay. How do you see both history and foodways shaping communities?
Well, I think food and communities are synonymous. As you think about the different communities, I'll give you, for example, we were talking about this a little earlier. I'm a former Syracuse lacrosse player. And in April, on April 1st, is the centennial of the Syracuse lacrosse program. So they asked me to participate in that celebration, and they said, give us some history of tailgating, because it's such a part of the Syracuse lacrosse experience. And if you're a student athlete in general, I once interviewed a coach and said, well, where do you all eat, or where's the place you look most forward to eat when you have a away game? And he stopped and he looked at me and said, well, actually, after the game, we don't really eat out, we tailgate. And so tailgating is a part of the food community. And I think every community has something, whether there's a Christmas party, Thanksgiving party, there may be a celebration for the employee of the month. If you're in school, most schools, if you want somebody to come to your event, what do? You have food there. So all those are connected when you think about different communities and different events. Napoleon once said, an army marches on its stomach. You can't have any significant movement or organization or team without having food involved. And most of us just take it for granted the food's going to be there. But let something happen and the food doesn't arrive, then we start thinking about it. See, my blog is called foodisalens.com, and there's a series on the blog called Stumping and Eating, the Role of Food in Politics. Any politician, when they're out, stumping is just going out and doing your typical speech of why you should vote for me. At the local level, they don't know where to go speak. You got to find out where I'm going to get the most bang for my buck when I go visit a community. Next primary is coming up, so where I'm going to go. You contact the political operative in your party at the local level, and that operative says, these are the best places to go and meet people in our community who are still not decided, and they need to know you, and they need to meet you, and need to identify you. 9 out of 10 times, let's say 7 out of 10 times, it's going to be a food place. It might be an ice cream parlor, maybe the best pizza parlor in that place, maybe a coffee shop, maybe a bakery. You're going to show up there and you're going to buy whatever that food is, and you're going to hang around with people, and the message is, I'm just like you. It's the same thing that happens when you show up at a tailgate before a game, whether it's a Giants game or whether it's a Buffalo Bills. You're going and you're identifying the people and you're breaking bread with people. Some of the most important business deals happen over food, okay? Mm-hmm. Anytime academics in here will know, and you're hired or you go to interview for a job, part of the interview process is dinner and breakfast. And if you go there and show that you don't have the right etiquette, and you don't understand how to talk to people, and you talk with your mouth full of food flying out, you have probably just worked your way out of that. Candidates are doing the same thing. They're interviewing with voters. And often that happens around food. But also what you'll see is in the case of David Dinkins, where his opponents were trying to undermine him by saying he's a black guy. If he gets in power, he's going to do everything for the black people, just like Obama. You hear the same thing. So what they would do is they would take him on a stroll. They have somebody who's well-known in the community, and they take him for a stroll through part of the community, and they would stop again at some of those places and get, typical food that people would eat from that community. And it's a way of people saying, I get it. Now, what can negatively happen, I'll give you an example of Mitt Romney doing this, is Mitt Romney went down south in Alabama to campaign during the primary. And he made the mistake of saying, wow, this is great. I'm coming down there. This is really changing me. I'm eating things like grits. And all the people in the audience have been like, okay, what's so special about that? That's what we all do. I mean, you're basically saying you don't know us and don't understand us and we can't relate to you. Yep. So people can do things. If you go to Chicago, all right, and you're trying to look cool like you're in, all right, and you go to a hot dog place in Chicago, don't ask for ketchup. Okay, so they will know right away that you are not from Chicago. So it's identity that happens around food that's really important. If you're in Mexico, there's certain ways you eat tacos, okay, and there's certain things you don't do. Those are what I mean about food and politics. So one thing is they help keep a movement going. Another thing, it helps you identify with people in the community that you're trying to know better.
Now, in the research that you've done, how do you think the food itself has influenced the identity of those communities?
I think it makes you an automatic insider. One of the dead giveaways is how you order. If you walk in and you're hesitating, you don't know what you're doing, people kind of know you're not from there. And people do business with folks who they feel comfortable with. So that's one of the things I see around food, your ability. You're telling people you're multicultural by the way you act around food, the way you eat food, your ability to cook food. All those things make people feel at ease around you. Now, for a long time, some of you may relate to this now, for a long time, I did not drink at all. Nothing. Not that I'm a slush now, folks. That's not what I'm saying. But I didn't drink at all. And I found, listen carefully what I'm saying to you, and I found when you went and socialized, whether it be with colleagues at a conference or family members, let's say you're at a funeral or a wedding, the people who know you, when you don't have a beer in your hand, they don't feel real comfortable when they drink. By you just taking a can, you don't even have to drink it. By just taking the can and keeping it in your hand, you'd be amazed at how it puts people at ease. Food is very similar to that. For a long time, I was a vegetarian. And my in-laws, they had a hard time relating to me. Because I didn't eat food. I didn't eat meat. Because I'm very interested in actually doing a show and hosting a show, and producers are calling me, I realized quickly I'm not going to be able to do a show if I don't eat meat, because there's going to be opportunities I have to do it. So I started eating meat about 3 years ago. Man, the relationship with my in-laws has improved drastically. Simply because they feel like, oh, he's cool now. You know, vegetarian to them, again, no offense, I'm one of you if you're out there, but it makes people feel that you have a certain air of superiority. And we all do know there are some vegetarians that do have an air of superiority. So food, drink, all those things, they have a lot to do with how people feel. During this time of the year, right? It's Lent. So there's certain things I'm not eating. And when people know that, they feel convicted that they are eating. So all those things are evolved around some of the things I talk about in my research in food.
In the Chicano movement, there was a critique of the men that they expected all the women to be the ones that are doing the cooking and feeding the men who are doing supposedly more important things. Do you find that in the movements that you were analyzing? How did that work out?
if you saw the PBS special that recently came out on the Panthers, that was one of the problems with the Panthers. They were very chauvinistic, and that was the expectation. One of the Panthers' hallmark programs was free breakfast program. As a matter of fact, the reason why our federal government provides funding to poor kids is because of the Panthers and how bad the Panthers made them look because they ran those programs. Yep. But typically, it was the women who were at the forefront of making the food. So it is quite common. And you see the same thing if you saw the movie Selma, which came out last summer. One of the most interesting scenes is when Dr. King and his entourage comes on, they go to the house of a local preacher, and one of the first things they do is they have this big throwdown meal, eating a lot of good Southern food, quote unquote soul food. But who's cooking it? It's the women. The men are sitting around strategizing while the women are cooking. And these women are the same women who stood up to the police, got their heads knocked just like everybody else, but they're expected when it comes to the organizing part to organize the food while the men do the quote unquote real work. So it has been a problematic that you've seen. Now, one of the things that I did for a book that's coming out, it's called Feeding the Revolution, the Role of Food in Social Movements, is looking at the role of food in social movements. And I was mentioning to you all before we got up on stage that one of the things I did in the book was go down to Occupy Wall Street. And I talked and did interviews with people who were running the food kitchen, the food committee. And that was one of the committees that had both male and female very much involved in it. There was no hierarchy. There was no gender bias involved in that. And it's because most of the people who organized that food committee, and it is so, if you think about the length of that movement, it would not have lasted if they didn't have the way of getting food there, preparing the food. They were feeding thousands of people a day for free. And one of the things that I learned is that the people who set up that, and it became the template for those Occupy movements around the country, they came out of what they call the Rainbow Movement. The Rainbow Movement were people who on a yearly basis would go to state and federal parks and have, in a sense, a retreat in the parks where it's totally volunteer and you sign up for committees. One of the committees is the food committee. So the Occupy Wall Street committee was run in a very extremely democratic process, the same way you do in the Rainbow Movement. So there's a difference between the civil rights 1970s movements and what you see at Occupy Wall Street. Very different.
So those of you folks who would like to ask Dr. Opie a question, feel free.
You talked about how you can sort of tell that somebody doesn't belong or that by the way they order, or eat food. And so I'm curious if in your work, if you have examples of things that you've eaten incorrectly or ordered incorrectly that gave you some sort of insight.
In 1990, I was a member of the U.S. national lacrosse team. The World Championships were in Australia. And as part of our meal, the Australians gave us this can that looked like peanut butter. And they gave us crackers. And when you opened the can, it didn't smell like peanut butter. It was Vegemite. It was one of the most disgusting things I've ever had in my life. Now, I was just talking about this yesterday in my class, and I have one of my students who, when I said that, she said, Vegemite? Oh, I love that stuff. It's a clear giveaway. And then if I broke out some peanut butter in Australia, most Australians would think it's absolutely disgusting. We're one of the few countries that actually eats peanut butter. Most people don't know that. But Vegemite is a prime example. If you were to go to a Starbucks with me, we talked about getting coffee earlier, it would be so obvious to everybody who heard me order that I'm not a coffee guy. I mean, my wife, she'd be like, boom. I mean, she knows the menu. When I go to Starbucks, I go, honey, order me something, because I'm not a coffee person. And imagine you're a candidate down in Miami, and you try to go into the Cuban sector, and some of these idiots have done this. I'm going to go down to visit a couple places where all the Cubans hang out in the morning, because that's how I get my cafecito and the whole thing, right? They all hang out and do that. One of those little shots like that, 2 of those, that's like 3 Red Bulls. But if you don't understand that culture and you're just down them, all the Cubans are looking at you like, you're not one of us, you're crazy. So I think all those are small examples of how we eat that's a dead giveaway that we're not from there.
What I find particularly inspiring about the Zora Neale Hurston work is just because I think that that's an integral part of the tapestry of, like, you know, obviously American culinary tradition.
We went through this discovery of kale, which is the most ridiculous thing I've ever heard in my life. All right. I won't even say black folks. I'll say Southern folks have been eating kale, collards, and turnip greens forever. I mean, going back to the colonial period. I mean, forever. And now to have folks discover it, and it's just as arrogant as we discovered America as Christopher Columbus. I mean, it's arrogant. And I think, and having people, you're going through the supermarket. This one woman was telling me she was shopping, you know, African American woman, you know, 50s, 60s, and this, you know, person at the store came up to her and said, "Would you like to have a taste of kale? It does this, and that." And I know she almost wanted to hit the person, like, "You gonna teach me about kale?" You know, it's just like me say to Babe Ruth, "This is a bat." I mean, come on. So that part kind of gets to me. But the other thing too is the new labeling and the trends. You know, eating local, farm to table, organic. How do you think my grandmother and grandfather farmed? They were farming organic. I mean, so all these kind of trends to me are ridiculous. And I find that, I'll give you an example. The country Senegal, okay, it was the origins of rice cultivation that went to South Carolina, low country South Carolina, Georgia, and became marketed as Carolina Gold. I mean, this rice was sold internationally. All the technology came from folks from the Senegambian region, which includes the Senegal, was brought here where black folks were teaching people how to do this, and then you know, white owners would make money off it, right? Today, the Senegalese import almost 90% of their rice because of French colonialism.
Yep.
It's like there's so many parts of the world, never mind the United States, are dealing with food lack, and they come from cultures and society that they forget we invented all this stuff. So that part of food justice, trying to teach people, you're not learning something new. We're asking you to return to your roots. To eat healthy is not to eat white. That's just so foreign to hear that kind of stuff. So those are some of the things that I think about when you talk about food justice. And a number of organizations like Growing Power out of Milwaukee and Chicago that are just doing some. This is an organization that will go into a blighted area, and they've come up with a way of creating compost so that you have healthy soil. And you can have a lot that's asphalt, and they'll in 2 or 3 hours turn it into a vibrant garden that you can maintain in your community. Wow. And you're not getting fish, you've learned how to fish. So recapturing places and providing food for yourself is a tremendous thing.
We'll be right back. For more interviews and related content, you can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, and other podcast distributors. Also, check out our website at www.fredopie.com. Ask questions on Facebook at Frederick Douglass Opie and on Twitter at Dr. Fred D. Opie. For information about advertising on the show, please email us at fdopie@gmail.com. That's fdopie@gmail.com.
If you like the show, check out the episode entitled Research and Writing Food History, which includes excerpts from Fred's lecture at Wellesley College.
And there are things I thought were, this is African American. I said, no, it's not African American. It's what rural people do. If you come from farm societies, this is what you eat no matter what color you are. And a lot of it was poor people's food. That when you're poor, you don't have the luxury of throwing things away. I tell my kids who are 8 and 11, when they say I'm hungry and then you offer them an apple or fruit, they say, oh, I'm sorry, I don't want that. You're not hungry. Because hungry people don't turn down food.
Now back to the show.
Now, when you talk about methodology, the year I did the Zora book, I had a fellowship at Harvard. So I had the whole year off. The most important part was the library sources. Harvard has access to all of these electronic publications of Zora Neale Hurston and all these historical newspapers. So I could get the book, Their Eyes Were Watching Guide. I could get her autobiography. I could download it as a Word doc and then do Control F and search for things like sweet potatoes, kale, greens, chicken, barbecue, and then create what I do. My process is to isolate things and to create Word docs, sources strictly around that. And then I put them in chronological order. So if I'm doing kale as the example, is any and everything that she has in all her work on kale, I'm going to save it in chronological order. And then I'm going to go through and I'm going to start making notes from it, and as much as possible, put the notes in my own word, paraphrase it, and only save quotes, direct quotes, when she's saying the point I'm trying to make better than I can say it in my own words. So when I'm going to actually compose the rough draft, I'm sticking on that section on kale, and I can cut and paste into the main document, and then start editing, and I have created what I need right there. Then the other thing I started doing is I have a severe case of ADHD. I mean, my students know if I write something on the board, you better write it down, because I don't like to write on the board because it's so hard to write and spell things correctly. It's just really hard for me. So I started using an editor, and I have an editor who I produce the first draft and then I send it to her, and she cleans it up and she makes queries the same way if I was submitting it to a publisher. So before it gets to an actual publisher, I have done probably 2 or 3 drafts with my editor. And one of the other things I think is good for all academics to hear, I told my editor early on is, I need you to edit this document so that my 7th grade boy could read this book. Most of us as insecure academics spend so much time using, the high performance language that only the dissertation committee could probably read, because we're insecure, instead of writing in a way where everybody can benefit from. Some of the books that get the most awards now are written by journalists, because they're used to writing for a general audience. So I challenge myself to write in a way, and I challenge my students to write in a way. And sometimes my students, so I said, read your thesis, and they read it to me. I said, I'm the only one in the room with a PhD, and I didn't understand that. You need to revise this. So that's the challenge that I try to do, is do great work, isolate things and focus on one thing at a time, create documents about that. And then the other thing that I probably have done that I really enjoy is a recipe as a source. I mean, so all of the recipes not in this book, but in the Zora one and all the other books, are time period recipes. It's funny, the other day I made a recipe for my kids, and it was a 1907 mushroom soup recipe. And it was delicious. So by having those recipes there, you can learn a lot about what people could source as material. Just a lot of things that come out of that. So I always try to make sure I have a great recipe. I love great images. That book's got 70 images in it. And so there's a lot of things that I get out of that. There's a book I'm going to do on the Black Panther Party, but it's going to be a graphic novel about the Black Panther Party and food, where I will take the images from the archive and come and get an artist to do the graphic novel. And I got my 7-year-old who will be the best editor possible, because he loves graphic novels. So that's a lot. I think for me, it's really important to come up with the ideal. It's probably harder than to write in the book. Because anytime you get an idea, I open my computer, create a folder, and give it a name, and then I just start taking sources and just shove it in there. And eventually, I'll say, this will work. I'll say, no, it's not going to work. I'll do a couple blogs off it. I'll start most projects as a blog series. After the blog series, then we go into a book. Then we go into, probably before we get to a book, it's going to go from a blog series to a podcast. And then I'm going to look to try to do a book and try to find somebody who'll do like a short documentary out of it. So that's how I work. I'm very fortunate that I only need 6 hours of sleep too, so I can get a lot of stuff done. But it's fun. I mean, to have stuff that you love to do, I would do this anyhow. Yeah. That's the thing that I always tell my students, pick something that you love. I can't give you love. You have to love the topic. Because when you get to the 3rd or 4th draft, when you get to the printout from the publisher, if you don't have that love to sustain you, it's like a marriage. Once the love is gone, the marriage is gone. And the writing's the same way. You got to pick stuff that you love. I'd say any occupation. If you don't love, you're not going to be able to do it for 20 years. It's just, you're going to fizzle out.
Speak a little bit more about the ingenuity of sort of enslaved chef culture, for lack of a better word?
So what we're talking about is that there are rations that masters would give to their enslaved people. I mentioned South Carolina Low Country, Georgia, which was rice-producing region. What they would do as rations is they would give the cracked rice that they couldn't sell for top dollar on the market, they would give that as rations to the slaves. Or in other instances, slaves worked on the task system. So you had a certain task that you had to complete. Once you completed it, then you had free time to work on your garden. And that's another thing that many masters did. They made sure that the slaves had access to garden land. Now, sometimes they might have to walk 2 or 3 miles to get to it, but it was on the master's property. And the master knew that if the slaves had an opportunity to supplement their diet with gardening, they would. They also, masters would allow slaves to raise livestock. We're talking about African-American culture. We talk about pork, the consumption of pork. It's funny because one of the first scenes you see in reading the book Malcolm X is his brother writing him and saying, I can't tell you everything, but just do this. I'm going to get you out of jail. Stop eating pork. Because it's been so involved in our culture from African-Americans raising pigs and selling them to gain money. Same thing with chickens. That's why you see so much involved with African Americans and chicken and the stereotypes. But these were ways that African Americans would subsidize their diet. Another thing they did is they hunted at nighttime. They worked from sunup to sundown. Once you finished your chores, you were allowed to do what you wanted. So many of them, nighttime became known as quote unquote nigger time, where they would go out and they would hunt at nighttime. And it is almost to the point where people thought they had like these X-ray eyes or something, but they just got so used to doing this. And so they would hunt wild games. That's why you see Southerners, eating a lot of possum, rabbit, a lot of that kind of stuff. That's all game, that nocturnal animals, raccoon, coons they're talking about. So these are all things they would do to subsidize their diet. There were definitely situations, again, depending on your master, depending on your skill. If you work in Louisiana or Florida, which were sugar-producing regions, if you worked in the sugar mill, that is the place where sugar was turned from this cane to the actual white gold or brown gold that people would sell, you were the equivalent of a mechanic on a Tesla factory. And you didn't get beat, you didn't get abused, you had freedom and access to things that other people did. So your diet was better. Your diet would be direct correlation to the skill you had and the job you had. And so that became an incentive to get you to cooperate more with the master. If you do such and such, I'll give you a day off to do this. And a lot of times the day off was to do things like raise food or go to market. Sunday was the only day off for a slave, where what they produced, they would sell. In a place like Jamaica, most of the land was dedicated to producing the cash crop like sugar. So what whites actually consumed, much of it was bought by enslaved Africans who sold those goods and those foods on Sunday, which a lot of people don't know about.
In my Intro to Latino Studies class, we talk a lot about the role of the United States in Latin America. And particularly, we do mention, or we talk a little bit about the role of the United Fruit Company in Central America. So I think the role of African Americans as in Latin America is not very well known. Can you tell us more about the role of African Americans in Latin America?
So just about any railroad you see in Latin America today, from Brazil to Mexico, was built by an American railroad contractor. During the antebellum period, when railroads began to be spread throughout the South and throughout most of the country, but mostly I'm thinking about the South, they used African Americans. African Americans laid track as enslaved people. They were owned by railroad companies, or they were rented to railroad companies to lay track. So many of them had that as a tradition in their family, and they continued to do that after the slavery was abolished. And so many of these people, when it came time to recruit workers to come lay tracks throughout Latin America, they went to the port of New Orleans, they went to the port of Galveston, Texas, they went to the port of Mobile, Alabama, and they would hire African Americans, many times with all kinds of lies, the same kind of lies you will hear when you go to work for an employer now, and you find out the job is terrible. But they would lie. They tell them all kinds of stuff. But still, it was better wages than back home. But it also meant things like working under guard, working with terrible food rations, all kinds of stuff. But they did it. And they also went to Jamaica, okay? Because by the time you get to 1840s, 1850s, sugarcane as a cash crop is declining in the Caribbean. Why? Because increasingly it's beet sugar that is cheaper to produce in Europe, that people are changing from cane sugar to more profitable beet sugar. Why would I want to keep a plantation with all these workers when I'm not making much money? So I set them free or I don't hire them. So you have all these workers who are unemployed, and I come as a laborer and say, I got a job for you in the Panama Canal, I got a job for you in Guatemala, I got a job for you laying track in Ecuador, and it becomes a really popular way. And so many of them leave. A friend of mine, his father was, what's the story? His father was born in Jamaica, grew up in Cuba, okay? Because of the same process we're talking about. So when you go to a place like Cuba, you can run into all kinds of people who their ancestors came from Jamaica, or they came from Alabama, came from all these different places. And what's interesting is, particularly African Americans, this is the height of Jim Crow. When they go to Guatemala or some of these other places, they're no longer black. They're American. So you have the U.S. consulate protecting their rights from abuse from state officials in these Latin American countries because they're Americans. And if you don't protect the right of the Americans, something may also happen to the white American. So by leaving the country, they actually gain more rights than they had when they were here, which is an interesting thing. It's also a time period where Italians, all other Europeans at the turn of the century are leaving deplorable situations in Europe and coming to the United States. Well, the deplorable situation for African Americans is in the United States. So they're leaving the United States for a better situation. Yeah. Kind of complex situation.
Yeah. So do you have, I know you mentioned Cuba, do you have African Americans staying in Guatemala and some of those other places?
You have generations that stay there, particularly ones who marry Guatemaltecas. Once they marry them, they tend to stay there. So that's something. It's interesting because there's one person who, when they had the revolution in 54, 55, he actually, his roots are rooted in a migrant that came over to work in the banana industry. Wow. Yeah. And you'll see them, they'll start out either working for the railroad, the banana industry, and once they gain enough money, then they become entrepreneurs, whether it's buying a cantina or a bar, and they're usually running it with their wife who has the language skills to help make money. But that's typical. And it's the police who are, and again, in many of these countries, the police and the military are one and the same. But there's a ton of records on them in the U.S. consulate in the U.S. archives in College Park, Maryland. That's where the Archive 2 is. That has all the State Department records. Because they have affidavits where they go to the local consulate and they're complaining about being abused or being arrested, particularly on Friday night when they get paid on the weekend. They get drunk and then the police have some excuse to arrest them so they can rip them off. So there's all these affidavits of these people where you can track them over a 10, 15-year period.
Yeah. Yeah, I think some of my students are shocked when I remind them that I believe it wasn't until 1967 that miscegenation laws were taken off the books in the United States, but that in Latin America, people were marrying across races, intermixing, and so what you mentioned about them marrying women in Guatemala.
And sometimes they're just common law wives. They're not even necessarily married to them. You have baseball leagues. There are Negro Leagues teams throughout Latin America, which many people know because you get treated better when you work there. So you see these groups of African Americans all around, but you also at the same time, you have Latin Americans that come over and play in the Negro Leagues here in the United States. So there's a lot of that kind of coalitions that go on and between these two groups that are pretty cool stuff.
But I was wondering if you had a chance, in this book about the origins and evolution of soul food, if you had a chance to see how it evolved in Brazil of all places.
The African survivals in Brazil are stronger than they here in the United States, particularly in a place like Bahia. and that area where that's where the sugar producing region were. So in Brazil, you see a lot of the food, the gumbos. They have their own tradition of gumbo. So a lot of the things that you see in Brazil, you can directly see it in Africa. Keep in mind, there's a clandestine slavery in Brazil that lasted up until, first of all, Brazil is the last place that slavery was abolished in 1888. Mm-hmm. But then you also have the continuation of slavery even after 1888, so that the survivals are much stronger. Now, there are collard greens in Brazil, which is pretty cool. Mm-hmm. They take them and they slice them really thin. And they're more raw, but because of the way they cut them, you can consume them. But again, it's this whole ideal of Africans, where they would go looking for greens. They call them bush greens. So in Jamaica or part of the Caribbean, we call them callaloo. Here we have turnip greens, kale, and collards. In Brazil, they do collards the same way. So there's a lot of similarities that are very interesting in my opinion. But every one of the countries, you have that European influence. So when I talk about soul food, it's a triad. It's the indigenous population and what that was and what they consume, like cassava, which is a very big part, plantains, right? In U.S. South, we don't have a plantain culture, okay? That's a Caribbean thing, but they have that in Brazil. You have the European. So what's European? In the case of Brazil, it's very strongly Portuguese. There are some other Europeans, but mostly Portuguese. And then you have that African. And Africans in Brazil tend to come from regions like Angola and more of the central part of Africa.
You talk a little bit about geography.
We have no cassava culture as African Americans. Yeah, in the Caribbean, in Brazil, through most parts of Latin America, and all of Africa, there's a cassava culture. Plantains are Asian. They came into Africa vis-a-vis Madagascar. That was the entry point where trade between Africans and Asians began, all right? Okra is an African plant that is used throughout Asia, even the Far East. Cassava, okay, it's from South America. If you go to just about any market in Central or West Africa, you're going to see cassavas. And if you were to tell an African that this came from the Americas, they'd probably fight you. So there are a lot of things like that speak to geography that people just have no clue. Chocolate, okay? Mm-hmm. Chocolate is indigenous to Mexico from that region. Mm-hmm. Most of the chocolate that's produced now comes from Africa. It's just to the point where very little of the chocolate that goes into the industry of chocolate production comes from Ecuador, which is another producer of chocolate.
To check out our podcast archives, suggest show topics, and advertise on the show, and to book me as a guest and/or speaker, visit our website, www.fredopie.com. That's www.fredopie.com. For information about advertising on the show, please email us at fdopie@gmail.com. That's fdopie@gmail.com. Thanks for listening, and be good.